Last time we talked about the first 2 years of life, and more specifically, we talked about the body and brain development, or the physical development, and some cognitive development. In particular, we started talking about language development. This time we're going to be talking about the first 2 years of life, psychosocial development. This is chapter 4 in our textbook. So we'll start off by talking about some of the emotional developments that we see in infants in the first 2 years of life. One of the first signs of emotion that's seen very early on is smiling and laughing. But around 6 weeks, we start to see the smile that shows itself in particular circumstances, and more specifically in the context of seeing other people. So when we start to see this smiling occurring in the context of other people being around, in particular being evoked by human faces, we call this the social smile. Around 3 to 4 months, we start to see laughter develop that's often associated with curiosity. So when an infant sees something new that triggers laughter, it's often it seems to be in the context of wanting to learn more about it. We also start to see the expression of anger around 6 months. Okay, so fortunately for parents, anger develops a little bit later after the smiling and laughing, so that they have some time to adjust to this new emotion that is really a healthy response to frustration, but certainly is not one that anybody likes to see in another individual, the emotion of anger. But it's certainly a perfectly normal emotion to experience. The next emotion, sadness. Unfortunately, this is also another one that parents certainly don't want to see in their infant children, although it's, again, certainly a normal response. It typically indicates withdrawal, and similar to what we see in adults, we see in infants that there's an increase in the production of cortisol. Now, you may not be familiar with cortisol. It's often considered to be the stress hormone, because when we're under stress, we typically find elevated levels of this hormone called cortisol in the bloodstream. And this suggests that, given that we see this similar increase in the production of cortisol in infants, that it's a stressful experience for them just like it is for us. So even though we can't ask infants what their sadness is like, there's at least some evidence from this hormone production that it's at least somewhat similar to adults' experience who can talk about it. Fear, we start to see this emotion emerge at around 9 months, and in particular, we tend to see it in response to people, things, and situations, often people, things, and situations that are new. So for the first time, we start to see this thing that's called stranger wariness, where an infant no longer smiles at friendly faces, but cries or looks frightened when an unfamiliar person moves too close. Now, of course, this is going to vary somewhat from one infant to another. Not all infants are going to show the same degree of stranger wariness, and this is probably very much related to the degree to which adults are introverted or extroverted. Meaning, they tend to be more pro-social or less pro-social. So we see the same sort of individual variability in infants as well. So infants here, they've gone from smiling at any face that presents itself to now being wary about faces and almost starting to evoke fear or more of an anxiety response around strangers. As you can see in this picture here, parents often want to get their kids' pictures with Santa Claus, but Santa Claus, unfortunately, at some point becomes one of those appealing new individuals that often evokes this specific reaction here in kids. And the experience that I draw upon oftentimes is with my nephew, and he experienced the same thing with Santa Claus as well as with the Easter Bunny too. Terrified of the Easter Bunny. Separation anxiety. This is when we see tears or dismay or anger when a familiar caregiver leaves. If it remains strong after age 3, it may be considered more of an emotional disorder, but it's certainly a normal part of emotional development to experience separation anxiety, or this unpleasant reaction to the departure of a familiar caregiver, usually mom or dad. Okay, so as emotional development progresses, anger and fear become less frequent but more focused. That means that it's not just any old situation that can evoke anger or fear any longer. It's more specific situations. So that's what we mean when we say that the anger and fear responses that we see in infants becomes more focused. Laughing and crying become louder and more discriminating. So we can kind of have a better sense of what they're laughing or what they're crying about, as opposed to just this general sort of laughing and crying into a variety of different things. So again, it's more focused. They're more discriminating. We also start to see some new emotions develop, such as pride, shame, embarrassment, and guilt. And these are really considered to be social emotions. Social emotions because of the fact that you can't experience these emotions to the same extent unless you're aware of other people. So these emotions require an awareness of other people, and they emerge largely from family interactions influenced by culture. So it's our culture that teaches us that when we do certain things that are considered culturally inappropriate, we should experience this emotion called guilt here, or embarrassment, or shame. Or when we do things that are valued by a culture, we experience this emotion of pride. But if we had never learned that certain behaviors were considered more good and certain behaviors were considered more bad, we wouldn't be able to experience these emotions here. So the ability to develop an awareness of other people is actually, and very interestingly, linked to the development of awareness of ourselves first, which we call self-awareness. Self-awareness is a person's realization that he or she is a distinct individual whose body, mind, and actions are separate from those of other people. So in the first 4 months of life, the first very early months of life, infants have no sense of self. And although we don't know exactly how they view themselves, because they don't really seem to have a sense of self in the first few months, it's believed largely that they view themselves as part of their mothers. Around 5 months, infants begin to develop an awareness of themselves as separate from their mothers, although they certainly haven't developed any sense of self-awareness at that point. Around 15 to 18 months, that's when you start to see the emergence of self-awareness, the emergence of the me self, where the sense of self is now indicative of the fact that a person can be the object of their own knowledge, the object of their own attention. And so how do we know when self-awareness develops? Well, the most common and standard way of determining when self-awareness develops is by using a very classic experiment called the mirror self-recognition test. Okay, mirror self-recognition is exactly what it sounds like. It's a demonstration of the ability to recognize yourself in a mirror. And before 18 months, most infants do not recognize themselves in a mirror. And it's not until about after 18 months, between 18 and 24 months, that they start to begin to recognize themselves. And, how can we tell whether or not they do or do not recognize themselves? Well, certainly we seem to have a sense of whether they recognize themselves in a mirror depending on how they behave. So, for instance, if they're laughing at the image, it would suggest more along the lines that they believe it to be another individual, not themselves. So if they display social behavior toward the mirror image, then it suggests that they don't recognize themselves. Whereas if they display self-directed behavior, that is, they act toward the mirror image in a way as if they were acting you know, toward themselves. It certainly suggests that they recognize themselves. But a more scientific way of studying this is called the Rouge test. In non-human primates, where this test is used, it's often called the Mark test. Either way, it involves putting a spot of rouge, a dot of rouge, on an area of an infant's face, you know, somewhere where they can't see it without the use of a mirror. So, for instance, if you put it above their eyebrow, they're not going to know that it's there because you put it. You attempt to put the mark on the infant's face without them knowing that they've been marked, and they can't see that without the use of the mirror. Although when you put them in front of the mirror, they could either react as if it's there. So if they touch the mark on their forehead after seeing it in the mirror, then that's pretty convincing evidence that they do in fact recognize themselves in the mirror. And if they don't, if they go to touch the mark on the other infant's head, or they don't respond to the mark at all on their own heads, it suggests that they don't recognize themselves in mirrors. So mirror self-recognition is just an indicator of the presence of self-awareness. So to sort of summarize up what we see in terms of emotional development here, at birth we've got crying and contentment. Those are the two basic types of emotions. At 6 weeks, we start to see the social smile. At 3 months, we start to see laughter and curiosity. 4 months, full responsive smiles. 4 to 8 months, anger. 9 to 14 months, fear of social events, separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, that type of thing. 12 months, fear of unexpected sights and sounds, and then around 18 months, finally, the development of self-awareness and those emotions that are possible due to self-awareness and awareness of others. Another interesting condition, synesthesia. This is really a blending of senses. It's very rare in adults. But a recent hypothesis or a recent theory about the way that infants perceive the world is that they perceive the world not the same way that we do, where we see sights and we hear sounds, but rather there's a blending in infants such that sounds are actually associated with sights, or tastes are actually associated with touch or sounds. That's what synesthesia is. Again, very, very rare in adults, but there's some evidence now to suggest, recent evidence, that this is actually common in infants. And it has to do with the fact that the areas of the brain, the areas of our cortex, that process visual information, auditory information, tactile, gustatory, somatosensory information, these areas of our brain are less distinct in infancy. So there's more of an opportunity for this sort of cross-wiring to occur, and that's believed to be the explanation behind why infants experience this phenomenon known as synesthesia. Okay, it's basically a form of cross-modal perception. Cross-modal perception meaning going across different modalities of perception. So again, you know, hearing sights, tasting smells, or feeling smells, something of that nature. So infants, they associate textures with vision, sounds with smells, own body with bodies of others, etc. And it's also believed that this may be a basis for early social understanding. Again, learning to discriminate between my body and other people's bodies. And there's also the suggestion that synesthesia occurs for emotions as well. That is that you know, the experience of one emotion can be sort of confused with the experience of another emotion. And this may be why an infant's cry can be triggered by either pain, fear, tiredness, or excitement. And laughter can also turn into tears. So there's this, there's this quick switch sometimes between emotions that infants experience. They don't regulate their emotions quite as well as older individuals do. So infants' emotions are often difficult to predict because of